So we'll start with some introductions. My name is Nicky Hatton. I'm a senior consultant at the Audience Agency. I'm a white woman in my late 30s with long brown hair and a ponytail. And I work alongside Carly in the research and consultancy team at TAA. So I work on a really broad range of evaluation projects across the arts and heritage and education sectors. So I would say that these are projects of different scales, some with small organisations, some with big national organisations. But the thing that probably links those projects together is that they usually have a participatory element. And by that, I mean projects that engage communities as active participants as opposed to audiences. I come from a participatory theatre background, so I've always been interested in how the principles of community engagement, I suppose, translate to evaluation practice and what we can kind of learn from participatory arts practice when it comes to evaluation design. So just to give you a flavour of some of the types of projects that I'm working on at TAA at the moment, I'm working with Art Fund on the evaluation of their Wild Escape project, which is a nationwide mass participation programme, which is aimed to bring together museums with primary age children. I'm working with Wigan's Creative People and Places project, and I'm also working with the Royal Horticultural Society on the evaluation of their new digital volunteering project. And I will hand over to Carly to introduce herself.
Hello everyone, my name's Carly. I'm a white woman in my late 30s. I've got brown wavy hair and I'm wearing a grey jumper and a black cardigan that I'm absolutely freezing. It's so lovely to join you all today. I work very closely with Nicky at the Audience Agency on mainly co-creation and participatory evaluation. My background is as a theatre practitioner. I worked across Merseyside early in my career before moving to the Coliseum Theatre in Oldham, where I undertook a practice-based PhD from about 2012. So that got me really interested in research in participatory settings. So I work with, very similar to Nicky, I work on a kind of a range of projects. At the minute I've been working with a couple of museums and art galleries, and I've just finished evaluating a project as part of the Birmingham 2022 festival, which I'll touch on later on in the session. So it's so lovely to have you all join us. Our colleague Emma McDowell from the Audience Agency is with us today just to kind of pull out questions and key themes coming out of the chat. And Emma also works for the Centre for Cultural Value. So we'll talk about that relationship and that piece of work very shortly.
Great. So we thought we would kick off with a little bit of honesty about our session today, about what we intended to offer for the session, which was something quite polished, and where we've arrived at, which feels much messier. I think it's fair to say that co-design is something that we try to embed into all of our evaluation projects at TAA at some stage or in some way. Sometimes we do this successfully and sometimes not at all. And I find that there are certain stages of an evaluation process which can lend themselves to co-design more easily than other stages. And of course, it absolutely depends on the nature of the project and the needs of the people involved. So you might be aware of lots of models or scales or principles for co-design that have been developed by different sectors. But it can be difficult to translate these models into evaluation practice. And there is no one-size-fits-all approach for community engagement, as I'm sure you all know. So when we came together to plan this session, Carly said, oh, I've got this great example that we could talk about. I've been using Padlet, which for those of you who don't know, it's a sort of digital journaling tool. She said, I've been using Padlet with this group of young people for the project in Birmingham, and it's working really well. It's enabling them to add feedback in an ongoing way and reflect on their experiences of the project. And I said, oh, that's really interesting, because I've also been using Padlets with this group of young people on the RHS project, and it hasn't worked well at all. They've hated it. And the feedback from them was actually they didn't feel comfortable sharing feedback that the rest of their peers could see. They wanted an opportunity to reflect privately on their development through the project. So as well as factors like age and interests and needs, opportunities for co-design in evaluation can be affected by things like the time available with participants, what the expectations of your funders are, and at what stage in the evaluation process you've been brought on board, you know, whether you've been there from the beginning or whether actually this is just a bit of a last minute thing that's happening. Whether the community meets online or in person affects co-design, and also things like positionality. So who are we to that community that we're working with? And what are the differences and similarities in our lived experiences, and how might that affect the co-design process? As people who are engaged in a wide range of projects with community groups, I'm sure you all know that meaningful collaboration with communities takes time, it takes effort, and it takes work to build trust. It's so important to get to know those people and to understand their needs before you start working with them, and to ideally embed evaluation within project activities. And I think we see this word embed or embedded quite a lot when we look at evaluation briefs where there's a co-design element. But it doesn't always feel possible to embed within a project. It's got a tight budget, and sometimes the participatory projects with the best intentions to co-design can be the projects that have the smallest of budgets for evaluation. So it's tricky. So bearing all that in mind, perhaps a more appropriate title for our session today would be around the messiness of co-design evaluation with communities, and thinking about the opportunities and the challenges of turning principles into practice. So what we thought we'd do today is to move through some of the different stages of the evaluation process and look at opportunities to bring in co-design. And we're going to talk about real projects that we worked on at TAA where we felt that we've learned something about co-design. We tried to pick a range of projects, some where co-design is, I suppose, built into the fabric of a project and where there were lots of opportunities to build it into evaluation, and other projects where the time available with community participants was very limited, but where we still sought opportunities to have moments of co-design. So as well as sharing what's worked well, we want to acknowledge where co-design hasn't been easy or possible, or even where we've just completely failed, so that you can learn from our mistakes as well. And we would really encourage you, if you're happy to please share any examples that you might have in the chat of projects that you've been involved in, of links to outputs that have been co-design or reports. If you're able to share those, we'd be really, really pleased to see your great examples from practice as well. So this is the outline for the session today. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the evaluation principles informing this session. I'm then going to talk through a process of co-designing an evaluation framework with community participants and some of the opportunities and challenges around that. Carly's then going to talk a little bit about evaluation methods and looking at the best methods that support co-design with communities and engaging participants in aspects of data collection. Then we'll have a little look at analysis at that stage in the evaluation process as perhaps one of the trickier stages in an evaluation process to co-design, and that sort of tricky question of who decides what makes the cut in analysis and what goes in an evaluation report, and what are the opportunities to do that in a way which is co-created. And finally, we'll have a look at co-designing evaluation outputs and opportunities for dissemination. And we hope at the end of that there will be a sort of good 15 minutes or so for us to respond to some of the questions and provocations that you're putting in the chat. So just to start with some thoughts that we had about why it's important to co-design evaluation. I'm sure you will all have your own thoughts about this as well, based on your own experiences of running projects with community groups. So please feel free to add your thoughts to the chat as well. But these were some of the things that we felt were really important to reflect on. So that evaluation includes diverse perspectives and voices felt like a really important reason. So that evaluation is representative of the people who are actually involved in the project. So that the outcomes that matter most to participants are actually built into that design of the evaluation from the very beginning, so that those outcomes are being considered throughout the whole process once the evaluator has come on board. So that evaluation can be more accessible, person-centred and inclusive. And I think that really relates to methodology and understanding the best methods to conduct evaluation for that particular community group. And also to give participants ownership of the knowledge and the understanding arising from the process. And I think for that one really relates to outputs and dissemination. So sort of thinking about how participants can have that sense of ownership when it comes to reporting or creating evaluation outputs as well. And of course, many, many other reasons why co-design is important. So please do add your own thoughts there as well. So I wanted to talk briefly about some of the principles that are underpinning the session that we've put together today, and talk a little bit about the Centre for Cultural Value and their work with the evaluation principles. So for those of you who haven't come across these before, this is a set of evaluation principles that were developed collaboratively by a working group, and that working group was made up of people in different roles from across the cultural and creative sectors. They're not a how-to guide for evaluation, but more a set of values that the artists and practitioners and organisations and funders who were involved in the process agreed should inform evaluation. So there were 4 principles which I'm not going to sort of delve into today, but if you are interested, I would recommend taking a look at the website, the Centre for Cultural Value website, and those principles, because I think each of those principles raises quite interesting questions about opportunities to co-design. So I think they're all relevant, but there's one that is particularly relevant to what we're looking at today, and that's the principle of people-centeredness. And people-centeredness is what the working group, well, they defined it in the following ways. They defined it as empathetic, many-voiced, and socially engaged. And I've just pulled out some examples here of what these terms might mean in the context of evaluation. So things like taking into account what matters to people, especially beneficiaries. And I think that really relates to that idea of working with people to develop an evaluation framework, bringing them in at the beginning to talk about the outcomes that need to be evaluated. Using a range of methods and creative approaches tailored to people, place and activity. And I think that word tailored is really, really important to this session as well. And Carly's going to be talking a little bit about developing and identifying the right methods for co-designed evaluation. We know that creative methods can be really, really helpful and important in increasing engagement with evaluation and making it more accessible. But also it's really important that, you know, creative methods aren't just used for the sake of it, and that the best method for that group is identified. Many voiced, so this includes things like seeking out and listening to different perspectives and allowing them to shape the scope of the evaluation on what's treated as valuable. And I guess that kind of relates to the analysis as well. So those choices that are made in analysis when you're putting together an evaluation report are choices about what is being treated as valuable. So that raises quite interesting questions about the opportunities to bring people into that process. Including those multiple perspectives in reporting and avoiding a falsely unifying authorial stance, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later. But I guess for me, that means sort of finding ways of capturing some of the messiness and the kind of dissent and the lack of consensus in a project, those nuances in a report, which also needs to be succinct and tell the story of a project. Socially engaged, so this includes things like co-creating with representatives of beneficiary groups to determine the purpose of the evaluation, and ensuring that it seeks out and engages with a range of perspectives, particularly from groups that have been traditionally marginalised. And I think that that phrase seeks out is quite critical here. So actually, part of the job of the evaluation consultant, I think, when working on a co-design project, is to really understand, you know, the breadth of voices involved in that project, and to seek out those voices that might not be quite so loud in a process, and making sure that there is an opportunity to speak to those people as well. So we're going to move into sort of talking about the different steps of evaluation, of an evaluation process now, and thinking about the different opportunities to bring in co-design. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the very beginning of an evaluation process. So that process of designing an evaluation framework, or a plan, or a map for evaluation. So when you are putting together an evaluation framework, you may or may not be working towards a table that looks a little bit like this, or at least these might be some of the elements that you are thinking about when putting together your evaluation plan. So you might, for example, be thinking about an element of a project that is being evaluated. So in this instance, I put as an example a community-hosted listening campaign, because that's relevant to the project that I'm going to be talking about in a minute. And there's a photo there of what a community-hosted listening campaign looks like in the context of this project. Outcomes, possibly the most important thing to identify when putting together an evaluation framework. So thinking about what is it that the project's trying to do, what are the changes that you're trying to achieve, and how is that articulated into an outcome, a tangible thing. Outputs, so thinking about what the concrete results are of what you are doing, whether that's a publication or a performance or an exhibition or whatever that might be. You might think about the indicators or the metrics, so thinking about how you're going to evidence what's been achieved, and how will you know whether or not the project's has been successful, what does that success look like, and then thinking about the methodology, so what are the best ways of gathering that evidence, and what you're going to use to find out what you need to find out. So obviously this table's a little bit dry. So sort of presenting that to a community group might not be the best way to start an evaluation co-design workshop. But these are some of the elements that you might be thinking, okay, how am I going to work with this group to make decisions on all of these elements, and what is the best way for me to introduce those in a co-design context? So I think for me, some of the benefits of co-designing an evaluation framework with anyone really, but particularly with community groups, is that the outcomes that are important to those participants are identified and they're included in evaluation design. And having that built into the evaluation right from the beginning means that at least those outcomes are built into the plan for the evaluation, and they'll be present throughout the evaluation. Yeah, as I said, so community input embedded from the beginning and shaping the evaluation. But it's also an opportunity to understand the best moments for data collection, the best opportunities, and what the best way is to gather that information for the group. I think some of the challenges of co-designing an evaluation framework is that you have a responsibility to include and bring out a balance of voices in the room. And I think that can sometimes be quite tricky if some voices are louder than other voices. Some people are more confident sharing their ideas than others. You might find that if you're running a co-design workshop, it might be the first time that you've met that group, so you're not aware of those dynamics. So there really is a job of a facilitator there, of kind of reading the room and attuning to those different dynamics and finding ways to support people to contribute in different ways if they're not as comfortable speaking in front of a whole group. So that can be a challenge sometimes. Related to that, I think is reading the wider dynamics and relationships in the room. So if you are running a co-design workshop where there are project participants and the people who are running activities and people who are overseeing the grants and a really broad range of stakeholders, what is their relationship to each other? Are there power dynamics that exist there? Almost certainly there will be. And how comfortable are they going to be sharing their ideas in front of each other? Can be really, really challenging if you've only got that one moment to bring everyone together to share their ideas. Another big challenge is that once you've done that workshop, well, what next? Okay, then you have a job to do of bringing these outcomes together into an evaluation framework, which is usable. And almost certainly there's then a process of distilling those outcomes and making decisions. It might not be practical to evaluate every single outcome that's been put forward. It might be that the outcomes that have come out of this session also need to be balanced with the mandatory outcomes that the grant or the funders have said need to be evaluated. So there's a decision to be made there about what is vital to collect. And the challenge as an independent evaluator is how do those decisions get made in a way that feels fair and representative, but which also feels rigorous and also tells the story of a project concisely to a wider audience with clarity. So I'd like to share an example from an evaluation project that I worked on recently as a sort of snapshot from practice. This was a project that I worked on called Credible. Credible is an acronym. Please don't ask me what it stands for because I can't remember. It was quite convoluted. But essentially, it was a project that was run by the University of Birmingham and their public engagement team. And it aimed to make health research more accessible to communities in Birmingham. And the way that it aimed to do this was by bringing together academic researchers at the university who had particular specialisms in public health with grassroots community organisations. And the idea is that the researcher and a community organisation would be matched, and they would explore a particular topic and produce a creative output that would make that area of health research more accessible to communities in Birmingham. So in the photos here, you can see on the left, one organisation decided to do a food festival as their creative output, and they displayed posters and had activities around their area of research throughout the festival that people could look at. And this other photo is one of the other grassroots organisations who, as part of their project, went to London and visited the Crick Institute and the Wellcome Trust to learn more about biomedical research. So this was a project which had multiple stakeholders and beneficiaries, which included 4 grassroots community organisations, who I should say were giving their time to the project for free, the public engagement team at the university, community leaders, and the academic researchers as well. There was also a really, really important team of what were called project support officers, which didn't really describe the significance of their role. These were people from community engagement backgrounds who had been employed by the university just for this project. And it was their job to help facilitate that relationship between the community groups and the academics. So their role was really, really crucial. The evaluation budget wasn't massive, and I'm not local to Birmingham, so there were some decisions to be made overall about where it was vital for me to be there in person and what could be gathered online. And what we decided on in the end was a two-stage co-design process. I started by facilitating an online workshop on Zoom with the project support officers. And then I followed up with an in-person workshop with the community, some of the community leaders and the public engagement team from the university. And I just wanted to reflect on some of the differences of those two sessions and some of the things that worked well and some of the things that didn't work so well. So the first workshop was with the project support officers. They were all pretty new to evaluation, so it was really important that I spent some time talking about what evaluation was and why their input at this stage mattered so much. It was important, I think, to talk about the fact that I was an independent evaluator. I wasn't there to sort of report back to the university. I was not employed by the university. I was an independent eye. And we also talked about this idea of the evaluator as a critical friend who is a sort of support, an ongoing support throughout the project. And the idea of evaluation sort of feeding in an ongoing way, in a formative way to the project, rather than just evaluating it at the end. I decided to share the provisional evaluation outcomes in advance, and these have been taken from the project funding application. And the reason I did this wasn't to kind of preempt, so, you know, these are the things that you should be looking at. It was more in the interests of transparency and sharing that knowledge with them, because so that they had a starting point, because they hadn't been involved at the funding application stage. So they weren't necessarily aware of what the project had agreed to do. I think one of the challenges of this workshop is that I didn't have complete information about the group when I met them to run the workshop. As far as I understood at that time, they were long-term employees of the public engagement team, and I didn't realise that they were newly brought on for the project, and they were still very much finding their feet at the university and in the project and in their roles. It was the first time that we'd met, and it was really difficult to read the room. They decided to keep their cameras off for the entire session, and they were quite quiet. So I was really sort of getting a sense of them feeling a little bit apprehensive, or maybe not knowing what to expect the session. The way that I approached developing the framework with them is using something called Google Jamboard, which you may be familiar with or not. This is a very, very simple way of doing collaboratively work online. So what I did was I just created a page for all of the different stakeholders and beneficiaries involved in the project, and then put this list of questions down the side. So how are they involved? What are their needs and hopes? What they thought the most significant outcome or change might be for that group, and what their best opportunities were for data collection. And then I invited them to use sticky notes to share their thoughts about all of those questions for the different stakeholders. So this was a really, really helpful exercise for me, because it helped me to gain quite a quick understanding of some of the needs of the different people involved. And thankfully, the support officers really engaged with this exercise. They seemed to feel more confident to add their ideas in this way. It enabled them to kind of input in their own time, and they could do it anonymously without having to kind of speak up in front of everybody else. And the great thing about the Jamboard was that it continued to be live after the session, so they could keep adding to it if they wanted to at a later date, if anything else came to mind. And actually some of them did do that after the session, so there's an opportunity to sort of do it in their own time as well. So the next step was I followed up with an in-person session, as I said, with the public engagement team and their community leaders, where I facilitated pretty much the same exercise on paper. And what I learned from that is that meeting those community leaders in person was really important in building trust and rapport and enabling them to feel listened to. There were a few frustrations that came out of that session about their experiences so far on the project. And that was in and of itself, it was helpful to hear that for the evaluation, but it was also really helpful to get a sense of their relationship with the public engagement team. So the fact that they felt comfortable sharing some of those frustrations in front of the people who were leading the project gave me a sense that there was, a fairly good relationship in place there, that there was at least a bit of trust in place, that they felt that they could give that feedback. Some of the challenges of that session were, first of all, attendance. So the session took place on a weekday in the middle of the daytime, which meant obviously not everyone could attend. It was a work day, and people were giving their time to the project for free. Another challenge is that it was difficult at times to distinguish between the job of creating the evaluation framework together and the participants' desire to give feedback on their experiences so far. So it ended up being a little bit of both. But what I did is I went away and I developed a framework which was based on all of this input, and I sent it back to all of the groups for feedback. So no comments came back after I'd done that. And I think, if it were to be a truly co-design process, ideally there would have been another workshop to go and play back some of that and present back that framework and to explain some of that process of distilling the outcomes. This would have been an additional time commitment for everyone. And there was also quite a limited budget for the evaluation, so there was no more budget for that aspect of the evaluation. We needed to make sure that there was budget to attend some other things in person a little bit further down the line. So I learned an awful lot from this project about co-design, and I just wanted to share some of those ideas about the benefits and limitations of the online and in-person approach for this particular project. I think some of the benefits is that it enabled more people to attend, offering a session online, including someone with caring commitments. The Jamboard worked well. It was quite a fun, informal, visual way of people collaborating together in a way that seemed to take the pressure off a little bit for this particular group. I think this model has the potential to be run repeated and do more than one session for different stakeholders relatively easily, and you can create new Jamboards, or you can kind of take the Jamboards that some people have created and share them with other stakeholders as well. I think, as I said, it really supported the participation of those who didn't feel as comfortable speaking up on the Zoom, and enabled them to give anonymous input, as well as continue to input to the Jamboard after the session had finished. Obviously, some of the limitations of that approach is that it's much harder to build trust, rapport, and to read the room. I found it much harder to put people at their ease. I did try to do an icebreaker, but it didn't really work. And I think often people are less confident about, or can be less confident about, doing icebreakers online. It's difficult to pitch, I think, on Zoom sometimes. It's difficult to get a sense of how people are feeling about what you're inviting them to do. Meeting online is certainly not meeting communities where they are at, in the places that feel comfortable to them. And it could be a missed opportunity to get a feel for the places where things are taking place and the project activities. And of course, an online session might be less accessible. It might be more accessible for some, but it's also could be less accessible for those who don't have devices or a reliable internet connection, or those with particular access needs. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Carly now, who's going to talk a bit about co-designing and identifying the best evaluation methods.
So when it comes to identifying the best methods for collecting data, consider what it is that you're wanting to measure, essentially. So what specific data do you need, and what kind of data? Are you looking for qualitative insights and stories of change? Or, for example, the number of people who have learned something new as a result of attending your event, or a combination of both? When and where are the opportunities for data collection? Can data collection be embedded into the creative practice? Can an artist lead this as part of a session? So ideally, if they are embedded, they kind of that's an opportunity in itself, because you've got a captive audience there. And then how are you collecting the data, and how will you collect this data on a practical basis? Who is responsible for that? If you're co-designing a methodology with participants, that what, when, where, how can be a really useful starting point to begin to think through some of these things, and also to ensure that it is connecting back up to that framework that Nicky's just talked through. Vital to this stage of the process is ensuring that the tools that you're using, so Nicky just touched on this then, so that the tools you're using are accessible. So ensure your principles around inclusive practice extend to the evaluation. So for example, the same considerations you might make in terms of setting up a space, welcoming participants to a session, considering access needs, those kind of considerations need to be made. We're going to look at some creative methods now, which, as Nicky mentioned, can be incredibly useful. But the question to ask is, are they the most practical and effective way of gathering the data that you need? Next slide, please, Nicky. So we've got a few examples here. I'll just talk through a couple of these and kind of refer to where they might be relevant and useful to you. So walk and talk interviews. What's lovely about doing, say, a walk and talk interview is that it takes the formality out of that interview setting. And particularly if you're exploring space, place, and perceptions of those things, it can be really useful to take participants on that journey. Drawing and storyboarding. So there's a couple of examples here on the right that are from evaluations delivered with children. These evaluations were around them recalling their experiences of particular places and art spaces and that kind of thing. If you're using visual methods, do think about how you plan to analyse that visual data, because often further context is needed to support those images. Graffiti walls. So graffiti walls are probably one of my favourite methods. I think if you imagine kind of lining paper on covering a wall, or that blackboard paper that you can line and just stick on the wall and just get people kind of writ large on the wall, putting their comments and feedback. So that's a really nice practical one, which I also enjoy as a participant. So when you might have attended an event on your own, and there's an interval or something like that, and those opportunities to kind of interact with these spaces and have a mooch around, I think, is quite useful sometimes. Physical methods. So physical methods really lend themselves to an active physical space, such as a drama or dance session. So you might have, say, a practitioner who's delivering something, and then they can do the exercise, where do you stand or where do you put yourself, asking people on a scale to agree or disagree, and then just marking the number of people that have gone to each of those sides of the room. And then poetry and creative writing, sculpture and crafting. I've got an example here of a session that I delivered where I asked people, so there were questions on the wall that asked people about perceptions of aging, and through writing, drawing, sculpting, participants kind of crafted different responses to those questions. And then I made sure to kind of go around the room and ask people for the context around what they'd made. So just referring back to that point about the visuals, and if you're making something, sometimes having that layer of context is vital. And then blogs and video diaries, I'll come on to that in just a second. I've just put some key considerations here at the bottom. So first of all, if you're using methods like this, do you or how do you plan to kind of value this work in some way? If people have spent a lot of time on a creative response, is the plan that you might give that back to them, or do they want to keep it? And if you're taking all this creative data away, where do you store it? Where do you store this creative data? Many of you will have, as I know, kind of filing cabinets full of old pieces of work. It might be reams of flip chart paper with sticky dots and post-it notes. So there's a question around what you do with it, where you store it, in a physical sense as well as in a kind of data protection sense if there are people's personal details. But then also factor in the time to be inputting that data. So if you've been working with participants for, you know, a series of sessions or on a bit more of a long-term project basis, when are you inputting that data and making sure that it's recorded and kind of categorized? And finally, on here, I've got blogs and video diaries, which I'm going to talk about on a separate slide. If you could flick that on, please, Nicky. I can see lots of interesting questions about methods, by the way, as well, which we will come back to some of these at the end. They're really interesting. So I just wanted to share an example of a piece of practice where young people have been involved in co-designing a framework, but also involved in deciding the methods and taking part in data collection as well. So our shared cultural heritage is a youth-led project that explores the shared histories and culture between South Asia and the UK. And it's a partnership project between Manchester Museum, Glasgow Life and the British Council. So I've got a kind of evaluation framework that cuts across various different funder outcomes and participant outcomes, etc. And I deliver that with staff and young people. And I've also got a group of young evaluators that I manage as part of this project who are of South Asian heritage, and they'll go out to these events and undertake some of this evaluation. But as part of this project, there is room for the young people to create their own case studies. So if there are things that they're particularly interested in, they'll chat to me and the young evaluators about ways that we can explore that. So the young people, as part of this project, they're from Glasgow and they are called the Change Makers, a really fantastic group that's based on really, I suppose, disturbing some of the narratives in museums around colonialism and that kind of thing. They're engaged in researching and activism projects around this theme. And they were really interested in exploring what the Glasgow Mellah meant to young people and how it resonated with them as children and maybe what it means to them now. So they came up with this series of words here on the right. So joy, candidness, remembrance, nostalgia, community and heritage. And they wanted to test some of their thinking around these themes and how it resonated with them as young people today. So they asked a young evaluator to go out and, in sort of treasure hunt style really, collect artifacts that might relate to some of these themes and also challenge them. So a young evaluator went out and collected videos, vox pops, photographs, and collected them on this Padlet board. So as Nicky mentioned before, Padlet is something that it's a really great free tool for you to explore. It's brilliant for scrapbooking as well, and any journaling that you might encourage participants to do on an individual but also a collective basis. Just another feature of Padlet is say that you can audio record directly to the board. So it means it kind of minimises time in terms of people going away and having to write stuff down. and it's all in one place for you. But anyway, yes, going back to this project. So these photographs and videos, the young people then use this data to explore some of the themes that they wanted to explore. So it was just a really nice example of young people kind of creating a case study within an evaluation, but also driving some of the methods in terms of what they wanted to collect, why, where, what was relevant to them. So this stage in a co-design process, if you are looking to embed co-design right the way through that process, an interesting way of doing that can be through engaging participants in data collection. And there are benefits to this and also some challenges to it as well. So I'll just zip through some of these. So a real benefit of it is that obviously the more embedded in the evaluation. And if you're working with a group who has particular lived experiences, that can bring an enormous amount of value to your insight as an evaluator, particularly if they say they're living in a certain place and they've got experience of that place, and they can bring new insights into it. Participants can accord relevance to things you may not have considered. So as an evaluator, you're coming at it with a particular set of experiences yourselves and a certain eye, whereas participants can kind of unlock things in a different way. So I always find that when the young evaluators I work with approach a project, they'll think about things as a young person that I've not considered, which is really useful. Skills development for the participants who might be undertaking this data collection, but also for you as an organisation in terms of embedding co-creation and co-design into evaluation. Some of the challenges, it can demand time and resource or alleviate it. So I've left that there because there's a bit of a question mark about whether you remunerate participants for their time in doing this kind of work. But obviously, if you've got more people who can undertake data collection, that's less time that you're having to be on the ground to do that. Key to this is that appropriate training is needed. And that's key to kind of people speaking to other participants, members of the public, the storing of their data, GDPR. So there are these more ethical considerations that are vital, really. And also kind of safeguarding considerations if you've got, say, a group of young people and they're in an event going out to collect data. And just in terms of shifting group dynamics, if you've, say, got a handful of young people or participants as part of a project that are undertaking data collection, how does that shift the kind of status quo of the group? And then there's just a point on there about are participants responding to the framework? So if it's a case of them going to collect data, have you agreed questions in advance, approaches, things that you want to consider? So a set of guidelines is quite useful that refer back to the framework. Next slide, please, Nicky. So I'm just going to talk about a piece of practice now where young people were directly engaged in data collection. And there were some things about this that worked really well and some things that didn't work well at all. So as part of my PhD, I undertook a practice-based study which engaged 8 young co-researchers over 3 years in capturing and reflecting on their experiences of engaging with the Oldham Coliseum Theatre using photo documentation and photo elicitation. So this method wasn't designed by the young people, but it was inspired by a photography project that I delivered that worked particularly well in the context of a theatre building. So in this instance, I needed a method that would allow the young people to reflect on their experiences of a specific place and time. I was interested in how they interacted with the theatre building itself as a place. So photography was a good way of doing that, as it can provide a memory anchor. So there was lots of interesting parallels when I was kind of wanting to use this approach between geography and human kinetics research. So a top tip is kind of explore how different people outside of your field have undertaken research and evaluation projects. Practically, so I'll just touch practically on how this worked. So the young people were representative of the demographics in Oldham, and they were trained. So they delivered a training they took part in a training session, to do with using the cameras, how to take particular photographs, and they also helped co-develop a framework or a set of guidelines for how we would all take pictures. And there was considerations in there around consent, for example, for young people who didn't give consent to have their photographs used. This might be a bit boring, but just in case it's useful practically, 3 cameras, labelled them A, B, C. So at the start of the session, I knew, say Nicky was using camera A, noted that down. And then the young people would take their images of a session. I'd upload them onto the computer in a data lock dated folder with their name on, clear the SD card. The next set of young people would use them at whatever session. And then I delivered 2 photo elicitation sessions twice a year with each young person. So I had a lot of questions in the chat around how do you analyse creative data? So you might have this sculpture or piece of artwork, how do you analyse it? So in this instance, the young people's context surrounding their images was absolutely integral to my analysis. The images spoke for themselves, and I'll come on to that in a minute, but the context surrounding it was also vital. So in these interviews, I used photo elicitation, which is where a photograph is inserted into an interview context, and that becomes the stimulus for the conversation. And it can shift the authority between the interviewer and interviewee, because the interviewee is kind of invited to talk about their memories and experiences in a bit more of an open framework. And what worked well, what was quite interesting in this instance, is over the 3 years, the young people got much more focused, in terms of the photographs that they took. They were much more selective about what they took photographs of, and the quality of the pictures improved. And then also they gained confidence in describing their images as well. They had real clarity when they talked about their experiences. And then just practically, they kind of took over the mouse. These pictures were on a laptop and clicked through. What worked particularly well about this method, it was really practical. So just going back to that point around embedding evaluation, the data collection, them taking the photographs, was very much embedded in the creative practice. So it wasn't extra work for the teacher or the young person apart from those interviews. What else worked well? I think what really worked well about using the images is that a visual thread clearly emerged in this instance. And for the young people, they took lots of pictures of objects and practices in the theatre that had a technical focus. So this really unlocked new perspectives around learning through a craft-focused prism, which is kind of an under-researched area in terms of theatre education. What didn't work well is I hadn't factored in that I needed the full data set in terms of the photograph and the context. So I went 6 months without having that data from the young people. Complete academic novice. I've not factored in my analysis time, but that really taught me something. Ever since, I've really firmly thought about the timeline for my evaluation in terms of data, input, analysis, report writing. Another thing that didn't work so well was the quality of the photographs was so poor. I bought cheap cameras, and the young people were really disappointed in the quality at the end of the project, and so was I. So I'd not considered that they were a creative output of themselves. So do consider resources and technology if you're thinking about creative practice being a prominent aspect of your research. And the other thing we'd planned to do was to do an exhibition of these photographs as a collective at the theatre, but then that didn't happen because of COVID. I also got pregnant, so no top tips needed for avoiding that one there. All right, next slide, please, Nicky.
Okay. Should I start on this one, Carly?
Please, yeah, that'd be great.
So I'm going to rattle through this one quite quickly because we are running short of time, and I want to make sure that we have a little bit of time at the end for questions, as well as Carly sharing a really, really great example of a co-produced output. We just wanted to acknowledge that the analysis phase of evaluation, I think, can be one of the trickiest stages of the evaluation process to co-design. And there's been some really interesting questions in the chat about analysis, particularly when you've got lots and lots and lots of qual data, such as an audio recording. I think, you know, when you have a project which has got multiple stakeholders and you're using creative or qualitative methods, you do end up with a lot of data and a lot of quotes, and you have to make decisions about what's going to go into the report or the output that you're working towards. Now, if the framework, the plan for the evaluation has been co-designed effectively, then that's a really good starting point, because those decisions that you're making in analysis are being made against those outcomes that have been jointly agreed. So if you're using those outcomes as a guide for your analysis, and then that should hopefully make that job of deciding what's important to include a little bit easier. But of course, you know, the opinions on what matters and on the outcomes that are important can change through the process of taking part in a project, and people might have new thoughts about that as they go along. I think it's also a stage where there's potential to misinterpret what people have said, or where some of those dominant voices in a group have come to the fore. So they're kind of things to be aware of, as well as just I think having a bit of honesty about the level of authorship that goes into a report, if indeed that is what you're working towards, and you will be going away and writing up findings, is just acknowledging that with the group and talking about that. And avoiding, as we talked about earlier, these falsely unifying stances, you know, phrases like, oh, there was consensus that this, or the majority of participants agreed that, if in fact that isn't true. And trying to find ways of representing that conflict or that contradiction or that nuance of a project in the story that you're telling. And I think for the Credible project, the Birmingham project that I talked about earlier, the levels of satisfaction were really different for the different community groups involved. So that was a really important thing to articulate in the reporting. And Carly, did you want to talk a little bit about the way that you've used playback and review in analysis?
Yeah, so playback, I think this is a term from Mark Robinson, who we link his work at the end of this presentation, which we'll share. But playback is, you can add this, adding it on as a session at the end of the project, even if you're quite new to co-designed evaluation, is a really brilliant thing to do to just check in about some of the findings based on your analysis. If you've got a celebration event at the project at the end of a project as well, that's an ideal time to do it. So basically what this is when you've gone away and done your analysis, you might have 5 key findings that you really want to check back with the participants. So you'd present these back to them and ask them to reflect on your findings. And sometimes you might have accorded relevance to something and been really interested in something in particular, whereas they have been more interested in something else, or you've not quite found the nuance in something. So it's a really good way of just reflecting and checking your findings. You can also, it also acts as a good way to add extra detail. So if something's come out of it for them and they really relate to it, they might be able to add extra or enhanced detail to a particular finding. So that's what we refer to as playback, which, like I said, I think we've adopted that from Mark Robinson, that term. Okay, so we're going to chat briefly now about co-designing outputs and opportunities for dissemination. So often, which many of you will be familiar with, participants will contribute to an evaluation, and then that gets written in quite an inaccessible language, sent to a funder, shelved, never to be seen again. So this is a really good way of valuing the knowledge and understanding that they brought to the project, and also disseminating it back to them and sharing it with a wider audience in a way that's accessible and relevant. So co-designing a simple output which summarises key findings and next steps is a brilliant way of kind of democratising that knowledge and giving it a legacy as well. So this is something you can build into your projects by asking, very simply, how do you want to engage with the findings of this research? What's the best way for us to present these back to you? Or in a playback session, you know, ask what's a good way of sharing these to the wider group? Next slide, please, Nicky. So I just wanted to share this poster that was created as part of a project I evaluated recently called Critical Mass. It was Birmingham 2022's flagship participation project. It was a mass participation project that was inclusive. So roughly there was 200 to 300 participants that took part, and 45% of these self-identified as disabled, neurodiverse, or as having a long-term health condition. So across the project, tools and resources in terms of their accessibility were considered. So things like using icons, colours, and making sure that the methods were accessible to that diverse group. So we worked with a reflection group, a group of 30 young people who were representative of the project, and they took part in discussions with us using a method called Most Significant Change. So I won't go into that method now. Do go and check it out. We've got an example of an organisation, the fire station have used that brilliantly. But essentially it's a way of storytelling. Groups share stories of change, and then what they believe to be the most significant change is voted on, and it just shifts some of the mechanisms of change and assumed outcomes of the project in a really interesting way. But we consulted with a reflection group on the most appropriate way of disseminating the knowledge that was coming out of the evaluation, and they decided on a poster as something that could be put up in rehearsals, but also there was an online group as part of this project, so it could be shared with them digitally. And we were fortunate as part of this project to work with a designer called Kirsty Hillier from We Are Frilly, who designed this poster. And Kirsty from We Are Frilly works in a really accessible way. She's also an evaluator, so came up with this poster based on key themes. So as I said, we were fortunate to have the budget for a designer in this instance, but it could be that you record a short video, it could be that you work with participants to pull out key findings and for them to disseminate that in such a way. Also, what's useful about this though as well is it can work really well as an infographic in a report or on your Twitter feed if you want to get findings out without people having to click on a link to a report and scroll through a report. These infographics can be really useful. And I just wanted to show you something as well, because I suddenly remembered about it in the break. Came across this, for those who can't see it because it's so blurry. No, you can't. I'll link this. I'll try and scan it in and send it to you. But it's a newspaper that I picked up years ago, and it's got lots of responses in it to the Ragged Trousers of the Philanthropist. And I kept it because I just thought it was such a lovely way of collating people's ideas and research and materials. So because you can't see it, I will scan this in and just send you an example of it as a way that you can disseminate findings from your research.